You're sitting in an Israeli Air Force bunker somewhere underneath the Negev desert, and the alert has just changed from amber to red. The screens in front of you are tracking 17 objects moving at Mach 3.2 across the Syrian border. Not Iranian proxies this time. Not Hezbollah. The electronic signatures match Russian-made Kinzhal hypersonic missiles, but the launch coordinates place the origin inside Russian territory. Your commanding officer has 30 seconds to decide whether this is an accident, a provocation, or the opening move of something nobody in the modern world has ever seen before. You've trained for this. Everyone has trained for this. But nobody actually believed it would happen. This is the story of what happens when two nuclear-armed powers with overlapping interests, shared history, and fundamental incompatibility go from cold friction to hot war. If this kind of geopolitical psychology has ever kept you up at night, you're in the right place. At Channel Name, we go deep into the systems and decisions that most people never examine. Russia and Israel have never gone to war, not once in the 80-year history of the modern Jewish state. That fact alone tells you something, because by every conventional measure, they should have collided a dozen times already. You have to understand the geography first. Syria is the chessboard. Russia established its military presence there in 2015, theoretically to fight ISIS, practically to keep Bashar al-Assad in power and maintain its only warm-water Mediterranean naval base at Tartus. That base gives Russia a presence in waters that matter more than almost any other on Earth. The eastern Mediterranean touches Europe, the Middle East, North Africa, and the Suez Canal. Russia's entire strategic relevance west of its own borders runs through that port. Israel, meanwhile, has conducted what military analysts conservatively estimate at over 500 airstrikes inside Syria since 2013. The targets are almost always the same: Iranian weapons convoys, Hezbollah infrastructure, advanced missile systems being transferred from Iran through Syrian territory and into Lebanon. Israel's doctrine is simple and brutal in its logic. If a weapon capable of hitting Tel Aviv is in transit somewhere between Tehran and Beirut, Israel destroys it before it arrives. They call it the campaign between the wars. Everyone else calls it what it is: a sustained, largely unpublicized air campaign conducted inside a country where Russian forces are also operating. And here is where the friction begins. For nearly a decade, Russia and Israel maintained what intelligence services call a deconfliction channel, a hotline, essentially. Before major Israeli strikes in Syria, Israeli Air Force commanders would notify Russian counterparts, not asking permission, notifying. Here is the target window. Here is the airspace we'll be using. Please move your assets. And remarkably, Russia complied. Every time. Because the arrangement served both parties. Russia got to look like the reasonable partner in Syria, while quietly tolerating Israeli strikes on Iranian forces, whose growing influence inside Syria was actually a problem for Moscow too. Iran and Russia are allies of convenience, not ideology. Russia does not want a Shiite-controlled Syria. It wants a Russia-controlled Syria. Those are very different things. But that arrangement was always fragile, built on the assumption that both sides had more to lose from direct conflict than from managed tension. And it held until the variables started shifting. The first major crack came in September 2018 when an Israeli airstrike near Latakia triggered a sequence of events that killed 15 Russian military personnel aboard a surveillance aircraft. The Israeli jets, flying low to avoid Syrian air defenses, inadvertently positioned a Russian Il-20 in the path of Syrian return fire. The Russians blamed Israel. Israel said it had given adequate warning. The argument became one of the most dangerous diplomatic standoffs between the two countries in modern history. Russia responded by deploying S-300 surface-to-air missile systems to Syria, a system capable of engaging Israeli aircraft at ranges up to 200 kilometers. For a few weeks, the world watched to see whether Israel would treat that as an act of war. They didn't, but they remembered it. By 2022, the invasion of Ukraine changes everything. Because wars create resource scarcity, and resource scarcity changes behavior, Russia begins drawing down some of its Syrian assets to support operations in Ukraine. The deconfliction channel becomes less reliable. Russian officers who once answered Israeli calls within minutes begin taking hours. Sometimes they don't answer at all. Israeli strikes continue regardless, because for Israel, the alternative to action is the completion of an Iranian weapons corridor that would fundamentally alter the military balance in the region. You don't pause a national security doctrine because your counterpart has other problems. And then comes the variable that nobody adequately wargamed: Iran's acceleration. By late 2023, Iran-backed forces are operating with increasingly sophisticated Russian-supplied equipment inside Syria. The line between Iranian and Russian military infrastructure begins to blur. An Israeli airstrike targeting an Iranian weapons depot now carries a real risk of hitting a facility where Russian advisors are present, or a Russian communication node, or a joint logistics hub. You are the Israeli defense minister sitting across from your intelligence chief at 2 in the morning. He is showing you satellite imagery of a site near Palmyra. The imagery shows what appears to be Fateh 110 ballistic missiles being assembled under a structure that, according to signals intelligence, also houses a Russian radar installation. You have 72 hours before those missiles become operational. The hotline goes unanswered for the 6th consecutive hour. What do you do? The answer is what you've always done, because the alternative is worse. The strike happens before dawn. 12 F-35s, flying profiles designed to avoid Russian radar coverage, strike the facility with precision-guided munitions. The target is destroyed, and 3 Russian technical advisors who were supposed to have been rotated out of the facility 3 days earlier, but weren't, because the war in Ukraine has disrupted personnel schedules across the entire Russian military, are killed in the strike. 3 men, 3 bodies in the rubble of a facility Israel never planned to make a Russian casualty site. And now you're in the scenario that everyone in the national security community has modeled but prayed would never happen. Russia cannot ignore this, not because of the 3 men. In the brutal mathematics of great power conflict, 3 soldiers is a rounding error. Russia has lost tens of thousands in Ukraine. What Russia cannot ignore is the precedent. If Israel kills Russian military personnel without consequence, the entire framework of Russian deterrence in the region collapses. Every partner Russia has, every proxy that relies on the belief that Moscow will protect its people, watches what happens next. Vladimir Putin, whose political survival is increasingly tied to the narrative of Russian strength and strategic indispensability, now has a problem that requires a response that is visible enough to restore deterrence but calibrated enough not to trigger a war Russia cannot currently afford. He finds a middle path. Russia announces a temporary suspension of the deconfliction channel. It's a message delivered in the language of operational logistics, but everyone understands what it means. Israel is now flying over Syria without Russian coordination. For 2 weeks, nothing happens. The absence of communication is itself the weapon, because now every Israeli pilot operating in Syrian airspace is doing so with the knowledge that Russian S-300 systems could engage without warning. The psychological pressure is its own form of warfare. Then, on a Tuesday night, an Israeli strike package targeting a Hezbollah command facility in the Kalamun Mountains approaches Syrian airspace, and an S-300 radar locks onto the lead aircraft. The pilot receives the lock warning and has approximately 4 seconds to decide whether this is a targeting solution or a test. He breaks off. The entire strike package aborts. The Hezbollah facility survives the night. Israel convenes its war cabinet at 6 in the morning. This is the inflection point that matters because here is where the psychology becomes decisive. Every government, like every individual, has a threshold beyond which backing down stops being strategic patience and starts being strategic surrender. You can absorb 1 provocation if absorbing it serves your larger interest. You can absorb 2 if you've managed the domestic political consequences. But when an adversary demonstrates that they can prevent you from conducting military operations that are fundamental to your national survival, absorbing the 3rd incident is no longer an option, because now your enemies are watching too. Hezbollah is watching, Hamas is watching, Iran is watching. Every regional actor who calibrates their aggression against Israel based on Israel's willingness to respond is updating their model in real time. The Israeli response is characteristically bold and characteristically dangerous. An Israeli cyber operation, among the most sophisticated executed outside of the Iran nuclear program sabotage, degrades the command and control software running the S-300 batteries in western Syria, not destroys them, degrades them, takes their targeting accuracy from 94% to roughly 60%, enough to create operational windows for Israeli aircraft. Narrow windows, but windows. Russia, whose most advanced air defense systems have now been demonstrably compromised by a country with a population of 9 million people, faces a second escalation challenge. The implicit message from Jerusalem is clear and contains a kind of terrible elegance. We can work around you. Your weapons are not as powerful as you've told the world they are. For a government that has been selling S-300 and S-400 systems to countries across Asia and the Middle East as the ultimate deterrent against Western air power, This is not just a military problem, it is an economic one. Saudi Arabia spent $3.5 billion on Russian air defense. India spent $5.4 billion. China signed contracts for the S-400 that took years to negotiate. If word spreads, through intelligence channels, through whisper networks among defense ministries, through the careful reading of what happened in Syria, that Israeli cyber operations can degrade these systems in the field, those contracts become harder to enforce and impossible to renew. Russia now has a reason to escalate that goes beyond Syria, beyond the three dead advisors, beyond pride. It's about the global arms market. It's about the story Russia tells about itself as a military power. The hypersonic missiles reach Israeli radar at 3:17 a.m. 17 objects, Kinsal variants, launched from Russian territory. They are not targeted at civilian infrastructure. They are targeted at Israeli Air Force bases in the Negev and northern Israel. The targeting itself is a message. We know where you fly from. We can reach those places. And hypersonic missiles traveling at speeds that give an Iron Dome battery approximately 90 seconds of response time are the one category of weapon the Israeli defense architecture has not yet figured out how to reliably intercept. 12 of the 17 are destroyed by a combination of Arrow 3 systems and what intelligence analysts will later describe as experimental directed energy weapons that have never been publicly acknowledged. 5 reach their targets, 3 runways are damaged, 12 Israeli Air Force personnel are killed. Israel is at war with Russia. The next 72 hours are the most dangerous since the Cuban Missile Crisis, and they unfold in a completely different architecture than 1962 did. There is no single hotline, no single decision maker on each side whose rationality you can appeal to. There are alliance obligations that activate automatically. The United States, whose security guarantees to Israel have always been understood as existential, now faces the question of whether those guarantees extend to a scenario in which Israel struck first, provoked a response, and is now requesting Article 5 adjacent support from an ally that is already overextended in Ukraine. NATO watches from the sidelines with the specific horror of an institution that was built to deter exactly this kind of escalation, but was never designed to arbitrate disputes between nuclear powers in someone else's backyard. Israel's nuclear posture, which it has maintained for 60 years under a doctrine called nuclear ambiguity, suddenly becomes the most important calculation in the world. Israel does not officially acknowledge that it possesses nuclear weapons. It is believed to have between 80 and 400. The doctrine of ambiguity works precisely because an adversary cannot be certain that a conventional attack will not trigger a nuclear response. Russia, which has its own doctrine allowing nuclear use when the existence of the Russian state is threatened, is now in a confrontation with a country whose nuclear threshold is literally unknown to anyone outside a very small room in Jerusalem. 2 nuclear ambiguities colliding is the worst possible configuration. The war, if that's the word for what happens next, doesn't look like any war the 20th century prepared us to understand. It doesn't have a front line. It happens in cyber networks and in the electromagnetic spectrum, and in the careful, terrifying language of diplomatic backchannels that are now moving at speeds human institutions were never designed to sustain. It happens in the oil markets, where Brent crude moves from $90 to $147 in 11 days. It happens in the Strait of Hormuz, where the Iranian Navy, reading the chaos as opportunity, begins harassing tanker traffic in ways designed to draw the United States directly into the conflict. It happens in Beirut, where Hezbollah launches 3,000 rockets in a single day at northern Israel, judging correctly that Israel's air defenses are now divided and degraded. And it happens in Moscow and Jerusalem simultaneously, in rooms where exhausted men and women are doing the same calculation, which is the only calculation that matters now. At what point does continuing this conflict cost more than ending it? The ending, when it comes, looks nothing like victory for either side. A ceasefire is brokered through back-channel negotiations involving Turkey, the UAE, and ultimately a phone call between Washington and Moscow that the United States will later describe publicly as diplomatic and privately as the most frightening conversation any American president has had since October 1962. The terms are deliberately vague. Both sides claim they did not lose. Both sides are correct in the sense that neither was destroyed, but the regional architecture that governed behavior in the Middle East for the previous decade is gone. The deconfliction channel is not reopened. Iranian weapons continue flowing toward Lebanon through routes that are now too dangerous for Israel to strike without risking another incident. The balance that was never quite stable has been replaced by something considerably less stable. Somewhere tonight, an Israeli Air Force officer is staring at a radar return and calculating the same thing his predecessors calculated before him: whether the risk of action is lower than the risk of inaction, whether the enemy in front of him will do what logic predicts, or what fear and pride and domestic politics demand. That's the question that starts every war. And it never has a clean answer. It just has a moment when someone decides,